So, with our next lecture, we're going to be focusing primarily on developments in Persia, which pretty much corresponds to the modern state of Iran. Certainly, Iranians today feel that this is a part of their history and culture, that as a people they go back thousands of years. And we're going to be looking at developments in India and then very briefly touching on developments in Central Asia in between. So, starting with the Persians. So, who are the Persians? Once again, we're encountering an Indo-European people who are migrating out of Central Asia. In this case, not like the Aryans heading south into the Indian subcontinent, but more in the direction of Europe. So you could say that they're, kind of those Indo-Europeans who decided to settle down somewhere along the way on the Iranian plateau. And the first mention of the Persians is in Mesopotamian documents from the 9th century BCE, right? So again, migrating from Central Asia towards the Mediterranean. And then you had others like the Aryans who were headed down towards India, and this particular group eventually occupying the southern part of the Iranian plateau, at that time occupied by another people, the Medes, who were horse breeding people, and with whom they're eventually going to intermingle, basically to create the Persian people. And we should note, just again, when we talk about Indo-European people, it is a linguistic category, but it does correspond in some sense to an ethnicity. If you consider that as the language is spoken by a particular people, and these people are migrating in different directions, in connection with which the language will evolve in different ways, right? So we have many languages that fall within this family, this Indo-European family of languages. And that would include languages spoken in India, Farsi, the language spoken by the Persians, and most European languages. So by the way, that also means that Farsi, or sometimes we say Persian, is more related to, say, German than it is to Arabic. So many people think that Persian is somehow like a form of Arabic or closely related to it. Some of that reflects that currently it uses the Arabic script, and it does borrow many words from Arabic, particularly as pertain to religion. But it is, in actual fact, structurally, grammatically, a completely different language. So early on, when these Indo-European people first arrive on the Iranian plateau, we could talk about the Medes and Persians as, in a sense, constituting distinct peoples. But right from the start, many similarities that is going to facilitate their kind of merging together and becoming assimilated into a single Persian people. Both were organized into nomadic clans. In both cases, these clans were headed up by what we might call petty kings, usually assisted by warriors that constituted a noble class, and then underneath the majorities of their respective populations being made up of free people, mostly farmers and craftspeople, and unfree people, slaves, right? So we do find slavery again as an institution here. Again, to remind everyone, we should be careful not to assume that slavery functioned the same way as it did in the American case. The American case, we talk about slavery, the term often used is chattel slavery, where slaves are seen as being subhuman, essentially objects that are owned and so forth. Historically, that generally hasn't been the case. So very often there wasn't, usually there wasn't a racial component to slavery. There was a possibility of moving in and out of slavery. Very often slaves actually had certain rights, and they were essentially human beings. So the Medes eventually merging with Persians. So when these Indo-Europeans arrived, they found the Medes organized into a confederation of tribes, and by 700 BCE had come together into a unified monarchy, but then eventually coming under Persian control. And again, at some point, we really can just talk about a single Persian people. So before the Medes came under Persian control, we could talk about a Median Empire, which then eventually will be a Persian Empire. But the founder of this empire, a fellow named Cyaxares, And, so initially you have this kingdom on the Iranian plateau, but very quickly they're going to start to bring other territories under their control, beginning with Assyria, a rather powerful kingdom in the northern part of Mesopotamia that they bring under their control with the capture of its capital, Nineveh, in 612 BCE, right? So it's really at that point that we can really talk about an empire that is going to very rapidly expand in both directions, east and west. And this is going to be the first of many Iranian or Persian empires in the ancient Near East. So almost immediately, this empire is going to be brought under Persian control. This will happen under Cyrus the Great, who reigns between 559 and 530 BC. And so, in fact, it's going to be Cyrus who unites the Persians in opposition to the Medes, and by 550 is able to establish control over them. And this is, from this point forward, the empire is going to expand very rapidly. And so they kind of have this system wherever they bring a territory under Persian control, they designate it a satrapy, which probably best translates as province. And each satrapy will be governed by a Persian satrap. So with the taking over of the Median Empire, we could say that that will constitute the first satrapy of this Persian Empire. So if there is one ruler worthy of the designation great, it is certainly Cyrus. And we might start with the fact that under his rule, the empire is going to greatly expand. Almost immediately, he defeats the Lydian kingdom in Western Asia Minor. This eventually is going to bring the Persians into conflict with the Greeks, as we already discussed in our lecture on ancient Greece. It certainly immediately brings the Greek city-states along the western coastline of Anatolia under Persian rule. And then he's going to subdue the eastern part of the Iranian plateau and move on towards India. In 539 BCE, he captures Babylon, which, though converted into a Persian satrapy, is allowed to maintain most of its government officials. And we're going to talk about that in a second, but it says a lot about the style of Persian rule. But before we do that, just to give you a sense of how big the Persian Empire is becoming, we might look at this map, and you can see that the vast majority of the territory is actually conquered under the rule of Cyrus, but it will continue to expand under his successors, Cambyses, his son, followed by Darius, inclusive of eventually bringing Egypt under Persian control. So as the Persians expand their empire, bringing various subject people under their rule, very famously, they're going to demonstrate a tremendous amount of tolerance, both with respect to how people govern themselves, so very often leaving existing administrative systems in place, but also with respect to other people's religions. So regarding the first thing, right, a really good example is when Cyrus the Great conquers Babylonia, he immediately claims descent from the Babylonian kings, right? And this might sound a little bit arrogant, but really what he's doing is, kind of recognizing and showing respect for their existing kind of ruling legacy. It also creates a sense of continuity. And in fact, it is something highly appreciated by the Babylonians, and in this way he wins their loyalty. So this kind of thing is also evident in the titles that they end up with. They kind of accumulate all these titles that in a way reflect a different kind of relationship with the different subject peoples of the empire, right? So for instance, Cyrus the Great, his full title would have been King of all, Great King, Mighty King, King of Babylon, King of the land of Sumer and Akkad, King of the four rims of the earth, the son of Cambyses the Great King, King of Anshan. And so you see kind of referenced here many different territories and peoples, kind of as a way of acknowledging that he has, in a sense, a different relationship with all of them. Now, again, the Persians were also famously tolerant with respect to religion. And we might once again look at the example of Babylonia. You might recall from our lecture on monotheism that at some point the Jews had ended up living in exile in Babylon. And with the conquest of Babylonia, Cyrus the Great is going to allow them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, right? So again, right, as long as they recognize his overlordship, he's quite happy to let them practice their own religion. And the Persians do have their own religion, but they're never going to try and impose it on their subject peoples. So in the end, Cyrus, very famously, a wise and tolerant ruler, and we should add to that an able ruler. He proves to be very capable at governing. Again, right, famously religiously tolerant. It's not just the Jews. Whatever people we're talking about, allowed them to maintain their priesthoods, to restore their temples, and to maintain their religious practices. And again, in the conquered territories, allowing native peoples to maintain whatever administrations had been in place. Of course, there would be a Persian governor or satrap at the highest level representing the authority of the Shah. But beyond that, they pretty much allowed people to kind of manage their own affairs. And as you might imagine, this would make the Persian Shahs, the Persian rulers, very popular with the various subject peoples, something probably nowhere more evident than with the Jews, right? And we find evidence of this in the Jewish Bible, where we find one Hebrew prophet referring to Cyrus as the anointed one of God. And this is quoted from the Jewish Bible or the Old Testament of the Christian Bible. I am the Lord who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd and will accomplish all that I please. This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of, to subdue nations before him. This is pretty high praise for someone who's effectively, from a Jewish point of view, a pagan. Right? In any event, Cyrus dies in battle in 530 BCE. You can actually visit his tomb next time you're in Iran if you want to pay your respects. And he's going to be followed by several Shahs who are going to prove equally effective. First up will be Cambyses II, the son of Cyrus, who reigns between 530 and 522 BCE. 4 years into his reign, successfully invades Egypt, turning it into a Persian satrapy and converting Memphis to his capital. And again, here's a really good example of how the Persians would show respect, not just for the existing system of government in a conquered territory, but also a kind of recognition of the legacy of rulership that existed there, right? In 525 BCE, taking the title of Pharaoh. After Cambyses II, we have Darius the Great, and actually there is a brief period of civil war before he's able to take the throne, and he will reign between 522 and 486 BCE, and we've met him before. It is under his rule that the Persians will encounter the Greeks. But he had some other worthy achievements that we might mention. So for instance, he codified Egyptian law. So again, though, it is, Egyptian law that is operative within Egypt. So kind of a way of showing respect for what already existed there. And it might surprise some people, he also is going to build a canal linking the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, right? So in a sense, anticipating by many centuries the very famous Suez Canal that will do the same thing. And he will continue to expand the empire to the east in India, but also into Europe proper with the conquest of Thrace, and then eventually attempting to conquer the Greeks. And as we know, he failed to do so, the decisive battle being the Battle of Marathon from 490 BCE, right? And so, that battle, in a sense, from the Greek side, led by the Athenians, and in the end, unable to bring the Greeks under his control, right? This was a pretty decisive defeat, and we've already discussed the battle from the Greek perspective, inclusive of, how it lent itself to the word marathon to designate a rather lengthy race. Nonetheless, right, on the whole, we should probably qualify Darius the Great as a successful Shah or a successful ruler. The Persian Empire, at this point, the greatest empire the world had ever seen, and divided into roughly 20 satrapies or administrative provinces, each ruled by a governor or satrap who represented the authority of the king or Shah. So, in sum, if we were going to, very briefly describe Persian administration, what is the responsibility of the satrap? Well, again, people are pretty much allowed to manage their own affairs so long as they provide revenue in the form of tribute, and this would have been collected by the satrap and then shipped on to the central government. The satraps were also responsible for maintaining security and justice, raising military levies, and commanding the military forces in their provinces, right? So that was the other chief responsibility of subject peoples, right? You provided revenue in the form of tribute, and you provided men to serve in the Persian army. So long as you provided those things, and it was the satrap's responsibility to make sure that all happened, you were pretty much left alone. Now, the satraps were always men of Persian descent, right? There was no question that a satrap should be Persian, and in fact, the major ones were usually connected to the ruling Shah. They were princes of the king's family, and in fact, eventually the position of satrap would become hereditary. Now, probably the greatest concern of the Shah wasn't that subject peoples might rebel or rise up against them. They were more concerned about the loyalty of the satraps. Some historians believe, in fact, that there existed officials in the satrapal courts who were spies sent there by the king to spy on the satraps, right, to make sure that they were acting on behalf of the king and not conspiring against him. Though we're not entirely sure about this, and if they existed, exactly the manner in which they functioned. Now, Persian government centered around the great king. The Shah had absolute power, but they were not seen as gods, such as with the Egyptian pharaohs, but rather as representing the chief Persian god, Ahuramazda. They were his regent, acting on his behalf. And as such, the king, or Shah, was the source of all justice. All subjects were his servants, and he had the power of life and death over them. And so there was kind of this idea that the person of the Shah should inspire a sense of awe. He was not someone very accessible. The Persian kings lived secluded in great palaces and in many ways very detached from the people, right? And this was kind of, part of this desire that, they should be someone before whom you would tremble in fear, right? Not someone you could just easily approach. The problem is that because of this arrangement, they did really become detached from the people and very often lost any, kind of sense of how people felt, how their lives were, whether government was effective, whether government officials were abusing their authority, and so forth. Kings became wealthier. They started to overtax their subjects, and this would eventually lead to some discontent. Now, the Persians were probably most famous for their armies, which, at least until they encountered the Greeks, were usually victorious and pretty effective. And a lot of this really just came down to size, right? They just had these massive professional standing armies made up of contingents from the different peoples of the empire. And that really was, apart from revenue, the chief responsibility you had as subject peoples of the empire, to provide men for the Persian army. So at the heart of it, you had a cavalry force of 10,000 and an elite infantry made up of tens of thousands of Medes and Persians, right? So the Medes and Persians would have constituted kind of the this elite fighting force. And then, added on to that would be whatever was provided by the various subject peoples of the empire. This elite infantry actually became very famous, often known as immortals. And some of you might have seen the film 300, right, where they're depicted as almost being these kind of mythological type monsters. And by the way, that probably does reflect how the Greeks would have often portrayed them, in a kind of mythological way whenever recounting their battles with the Persians. But they were regular human beings. They were called immortals because they had this kind of system that whoever was out there fighting, they would never allow the number to fall below 10,000, right? So they would have, upwards of 10,000 men on the battlefield at one time, and a huge number of reserves. And whenever the numbers dwindled down to around 10,000, from that point on, whatever immortals were lost, they would replenish those numbers. And, if you were fighting against them, it really created this kind of sense that, like, somehow you just couldn't eliminate them, that you're making no headway. A little bit of this kind of, Hydra, cut off one head, two will take its place, right? So, that's why they were known as immortals, because it really felt you just couldn't kill them, right? Their numbers never diminished in battle. So the last thing I want to discuss in connection with the Persians is their religion, Zoroastrianism. So if we go back to the beginning, popular religion initially focused on the worship of the powers of nature, but then by the 6th century B.C.E., a new religion had arisen around a legendary figure known as Zoroaster, or sometimes Zarathustra. I mentioned that other version of his name because later on it will be appropriated by a very famous 19th century German philosopher named Nietzsche, and he'll use him as a kind of vehicle to relate his own philosophy in a book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And some of you might have come across that, so you might be interested to know that. Again, legendary figure. We can't say for sure that he actually lived. I think there's a reasonable likelihood that he did, but supposedly he founded this new religion that will take its name from him. So, according to Persian tradition, Zoroaster was born in 660 B.C.E. And then following a period of wandering and solitude, so it's pretty standard fare for the founders of religions, he experienced a series of revelations regarding the true religion. Now, what his original teachings is kind of hard to say for sure. The sacred book of Zoroastrianism wasn't written down until much later, 3rd century CE, so we're talking 850 years down the road. Sometimes through a kind of careful analysis of the language in the Holy Book of Zoroastrianism, you might discern which portions of it probably date back maybe to the beginning. Some historians have been able to piece together his message from portions they believe date back to his time. But again, a lot of this is a kind of guesswork. And, by the way, this kind of thing is an issue in most of the great world's faiths, whether Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, right? So not something unique to Zoroastrianism. In any event, what are the key beliefs of this faith? Zoroaster taught that Ahuramazda, long an Iranian deity, wasn't, that he didn't exist until then, but, was seen as one of many gods. But Zoroaster is basically going to say that he is, in fact, the only god, and that his religion, what he is presenting here, is the only perfect, true understanding of, the nature of the spiritual realm, of the divine, and so forth. And so what does he teach about Ahuramazda? That he brought all things into being. He possesses also the abstract qualities or states that all humans should aspire to. Good thought, right behavior, piety. That he basically, Ahuramazda embodies everything that is good in the world. That does raise the question, though, of where does evil come from, right? Is Ahuramazda responsible for those things that are not good, bad things? And the answer, in Zoroastrianism at least, is no. There is another being, and to be clear, Ahuramazda is supreme, but he is not alone. He is opposed by the evil spirit Ahriman. And so you have this kind of idea that, Ahuramazda represents good and is in constant conflict with Ahriman, who represents evil. Ahriman represents such qualities as falsehood and death, and there is a cosmic struggle between the two. And every human has the freedom to choose, the power to choose between right and wrong. So we often talk about Zoroastrianism as being defined by dualism, right? This idea of opposites being in conflict with one another, good versus evil, God versus the devil, right versus wrong, and then of course, heaven versus hell, depending on how you choose. There are some historians who feel that this kind of dualism might have actually influenced Christianity. That ideas in Christianity about God versus the devil, good versus evil, and so forth, were in effect borrowed from Zoroastrianism. This is a difficult thing to prove one way or the other, but there is this kind of theory out there. And this would include ideas about heaven versus hell, right? Ahuramazda would eventually triumph and there would be a final judgment. And again, this probably sounds very familiar if you're a Christian and familiar, pretty well versed in your faith. There will be a final judgment, and at which point there will also be a final separation between good and evil. But each of us will face a final evaluation of our actions, right? And those who were good will go to paradise, and those who committed evil would be thrown into the abyss. And again, this probably sounds very familiar if you're a Christian and you're pretty well versed in your faith, right? The basic tenets of your faith. By the way, that image to the left is a guardian angel, known as a Faravahar, a symbol of a guardian angel, right? That would help to ward off evil. So that is not maybe such a common element in other faiths, though not entirely unfamiliar. So Zoroastrianism's influence, at least with respect to the Persian Empire, is going to be pretty large, right? It is adopted by the Persian kings. It becomes kind of the faith of the ruling elite. So, remember again, Persians are very tolerant of other religions. And in fact, in some ways, they really don't even want you to adopt Zoroastrianism. They see this as something kind of belonging to them. It will be extremely influential nonetheless on the religious practices of subject peoples, therefore informing other religions. Again, we already talked about how it may have influenced certain developments in the Christian faith. In particular, probably this dualism is going to be its most influential element, right? This abstract struggle between good and evil, which in Zoroastrianism is much more concrete, right? There is an actual spirit of evil, and it's trying to encourage people to do wrong things, related to which, they're going to develop many, many different ways of trying to ward off evil by using spells and incantations. Very famous probably would be this idea of, this kind of eye on the hand, which supposedly wards off evil. And again, just to finally, kind of conclude this theory that Christian ideas about the dualism of good versus evil and a final judgment day may reflect Zoroastrian influence. We don't know for sure. And by the way, Zoroastrianism still exists today, but it is a dying religion. According to the United Nations, they expect that it will cease to exist, possibly within the next 50 years. So it's a very small community, mostly based in present-day India. At some point, with the arrival of Islam, it will be difficult for Zoroastrians to remain in Iran. But you do have Zoroastrian communities throughout the world, very small, and they really do very little to encourage people to convert to their faith. So this is probably the main reason it will likely die out. In any event, at this point, we now turn to developments in India, and mainly looking at the establishment there of the Mauryan Empire, which will begin in the northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent, initially based in Gandhara, and it established in the wake of Alexander the Great's conquests in 321 BCE. Right? So when Alexander the Great entered India, it kind of shook things up a bit, and basically the individuals who founded this empire were able to take advantage. And it will actually incorporate elements of both Greek and Indian culture, though probably taking more from Indian culture, and in some ways kind of establishing the first true Indian empire, right? So kind of playing a role in creating a greater sense of being, different parts of India, different peoples living there, being part of a shared Indian identity. So prior to this, politically, to be sure, but even to some degree, in terms of how people identified themselves, India very fragmented, right? In some ways, it makes more sense, particularly at this point, to talk of India as a continent rather than somehow a country, wherein the people who live there feel that they are one people. So, between the 7th and 4th centuries BCE, particularly, and mostly we're kind of focusing on northern India around the Ganges plain, we see the rise of a large number of dynastic states. And then further north in the Himalayan foothills, we find a fair number of tribal republics, right? So very politically fragmented, very divided, not really a sense of constituting a single people. So it's in this environment, again, after Alexander the Great, kind of shook things up a bit, his invasion was a bit disruptive, weakened a few of the kingdoms, that an individual is going to be able to take advantage to lay the foundation for what will eventually become a huge empire. And this individual, who we might characterize as an adventurer, someone with a bit of ambition and daring, a fellow named Chandragupta Maurya, is going to lay the foundations for a vast empire, beginning with the seizure of territory in the Ganges region around 324 BCE. And again, he's kind of taking advantage of the vacuum created by Alexander the Great. So, he came in there, kind of weakened some of the kingdoms, took over some territory, but then very quickly departed, right? So it created kind of a power vacuum that Chandragupta is taking advantage of to bring the Indus region under his control, right? The Indus region being in the northwest part of the Indian subcontinent, roughly corresponding in part to modern-day Pakistan, and then very quickly bringing some of the surrounding territory under his control, sometimes through treaties, particularly when it involved the Greeks. And very quickly, let's say by 303 BCE, he is on his way. And then eventually marching down the Ganges River in a kind of southeast direction and bringing a vast amount of territory under his control. And then establishing his capital at Pataliputra, which you can't see here on the map. I just couldn't find a map that showed it, but it's somewhere down, let's say along the Ganges River, roughly at the point where it breaks up into a kind of delta formation. So we should note in connection with his success, right? He's very effective at conquering territory, but then also very effective at administering it, in part because he has a brilliant Brahmin minister to support him named Kautilya, sometimes referred to as the Indian Machiavelli, because he's going to write a book that is much like Machiavelli in Renaissance Italy, a book that functions almost as an instruction manual for how to govern. Just because I don't want to assume people know who Machiavelli is, he was a Florentine diplomat who at some point was sent into exile, during which time he wrote a book called The Prince, and it effectively was a manual for how to govern, very famously kind of promoting the idea that a ruler has to be, to some degree, pretty ruthless, prepared to, do the dirty work, if it is necessary and to the benefit of the state. Kind of the idea that if you're not willing to break a few eggs, you shouldn't get into the business of governing. Kautilya, not quite so ruthless, but he does write a book that effectively acts as a manual of government in a similar way, known as the Ardha Shastra, probably the most famous Indian treatise on the art of government. We should note it's not entirely clear that the entirety of it is attributable to him, to one individual, in fact, but it is definitely associated with his name. And, it does seem pretty clear that he will help Chandragupta to effectively govern this new empire he's created. Having said that, probably the greatest Mauryan ruler will be the third one, a fellow named Ashoka, who, in addition to greatly expanding the territory of the empire, will very effectively govern it, and it will be a period during which the Mauryan Empire will flourish. So first of all, he also proves to be an excellent lawgiver, in some ways kind of the Hammurabi of the Mauryan Empire. Much like Hammurabi, he has a series of edicts inscribed into rocks and then situated at various points in his empire, right? So, kind of the idea that the law should be applied in a consistent manner and everyone should have the opportunity to become familiar with it. So we find numerous rock inscriptions throughout India, and these are in fact the first significant decipherable Indian written sources that we have. And much as with how historians use Hammurabi's code, they tell us a great deal about his reign and his character and about society in the Mauryan Empire in general. By the way, on the right we see the lion capital of Ashoka, the lion, a symbol of his rule. And here we have one of these rocks inscribed with his edicts. And again, the same idea as with Hammurabi. His code would have been inscribed on these metal steels, but there would have been multiple copies of it, showing exactly the same thing, situated at various points throughout the empire. Same basic idea here, except inscribed on rocks. So, maybe not quite as glamorous, but no doubt very effective. So this is kind of the high watermark of the Mauryan Empire, and this also reflects the fact that it has a very well-developed administration at this point, highly centralized. At the center, you have a king with an advisory council. Very standardized administrative practices, so the government is carried out in the same way throughout the empire, related to which you have a very well-developed system of long-distance communication, which is no small feat if you really think about it, right? Not just given the size of this empire, the size of the Indian subcontinent, but also the kind of jungle terrain that you have to deal with, right? To try and develop, a very effective network of roads that will allow for long-distance communication. But this is also very necessary if you want to have effective administration, right? In the sense of, the king being able to get information about what's happening in different parts of his empire, and then, being able to relay very rapidly his instruction, edicts, and so forth to different points, again, within the empire, right? So that is highly developed. There's also very strong civil and military organization. So everything operating very efficiently. Provinces controlled by governors who are sent out from the capital, or in some cases by local rulers who are confirmed by the king. Right. So sometimes if a territory were conquered, he would allow the previously ruling king to stay in place, but now as a governor. A well-developed road system, also very important for collecting revenue, in this case by taxing agricultural produce, but also urban trade and production. And we might note, in as much as we're also describing Mauryan society, that we do have slavery once again, but here it is a kind of temporary indentured service, meaning that, after you've paid off your debt, and it's kind of your debt which probably drove you into slavery, you would probably be freed. So Hinduism will definitely flourish under Ashoka, but he himself will actively promote Buddhism, first and foremost by converting to it, and then providing a kind of role model by pursuing the Buddhist middle path. He himself will forsake hunting and eating meat and will champion ahimsa or non-violence. You might remember ahimsa at the core of Jainism, also relevant in a more moderate form to Buddhism. Now, probably most important is he will really focus on good government, right? For him, the best way to demonstrate the virtues of Buddhism is to be an effective and caring ruler. He really characterizes his subjects as children to be cared for. Really, feels that one should lead by providing justice, should never turn to aggression, the idea of compelling obedience through fear, and really showing a concern for the public welfare. He will appoint Dharma officials to investigate the public welfare, to make sure that government officials are not behaving in a corrupt way. The term Dharma here you might be familiar with, kind of a reference to the idea that particularly if talking about government officials, they should be fulfilling their dharma by acting on behalf of the public welfare. So, very actively promoting Buddhist teachings, but very tolerant of all religious traditions, right? So not doing anything to actually suppress, for instance, the spread of Hinduism. In some ways, perhaps the most important development during this period under Ashoka in particular is going to be this kind of unifying of India, the forging of a definable Indian culture, right? As the various peoples living throughout the Indian subcontinent become more familiar with one another, coming into contact with one another, and then sharing different traits, practices, beliefs, and so forth. So this is all encouraging what we call a cosmopolitan outlook or cosmopolitan traditions, right? This kind of more open-minded attitude towards, how other people do things. This is very different from provincialism, wherein it's like, how we do things is right and how other people do things is wrong and just weird, and you become resistant to outside influences. But very often that doesn't happen if you have regular contact with other people. So a major factor here is the excellent road system that's developed that greatly facilitates internal and external contacts and promotes the spread of culture, but also religious ideas. So very important to the spread of Buddhism, but also various ideas related to Hinduism, that eventually are helping to share a kind of single kind of defined tradition of Hinduism that is recognizable to everyone. This is also going to be very good for trade and for generating wealth, right? This is an era that will see the flourishing of cities as centers for arts, crafts, industry, literature, and education. And on the subject of this network of roads, we should note that it actually links up with a much broader network known as the Silk Road. Right, so bringing Indians into contact with people in China, with people to the east as far away as the Mediterranean, and so making for an even more cosmopolitan kind of culture. We might conclude our discussion of Ashoka by noting that he will come to embody the ideal of the perfect king. And pretty much after his rule, things very quickly begin to disintegrate, likely due to economic strains, but also the problem of bureaucratic corruption. And before too long, local dynasties will begin to seize power, and India will fragment. Nonetheless, the memory of Ashoka will carry on. He will provide the model for many different kind of political philosophers of the ideal king. And this will be true both for within Hindu and Buddhist thought. He comes to represent the universal monarch who rules with righteousness, justice, and wisdom. And we should note that even with the political fragmentation of the Indian subcontinent, it would appear that the Mauryan Empire laid a very strong foundation such that in many respects, the subcontinent will continue to flourish and do pretty well, right? So things break down politically, but not necessarily socially and economically. Some of this reflects India's location, this kind of central location with respect to world trade, the fact that it's kind of tied into the Silk Road. And so, as both the Roman Empire and China flourish on either side of India, this will prove beneficial to Indians, right? Particularly the merchant class, which will prosper. And many of them, by the way, many merchants will adopt Buddhism. Buddhism is going to enjoy tremendous favor among merchants. They like this kind of more moderate approach to achieving salvation, or as defined in Buddhism, nirvana. Some will adopt Jainism, but that's will remain kind of a minority religion. Why is it important that merchants would adopt either religion? Is that they become a major source of patronage for both, particularly Buddhism. That becomes a major factor in the spread of Buddhism, right? Merchants will carry it with them, and very often introduce it to the peoples with whom they trade further afield. But also through the patronage, we will see the proliferation of monasteries and providing financial support also for Buddhist monks. And so that becomes another way by which Buddhism spreads. During this period, and this is kind of post-Mauryan Empire, guild organizations will flourish, and very often providing kind of a technical education in skilled crafts. So again, things carrying on quite nicely economically. Even though things have politically fragmented, banking and the minting of coin both flourishing, right? We see an increase in coin minting and a proliferation of banks, all of which greatly facilitates economic activity across the Indian subcontinent. Finally, we might discuss certain cultural developments during the Mauryan Empire. For instance, with respect to art, in the northwest part of the empire, we see the development of the Gandharan school of Buddhist art during this period, very famously incorporating elements of Hellenistic art, particularly as pertained to naturalism, but incorporating that within, for that time, more recent Indian traditions. We have two examples of this artistic tradition here. And I think it might not be evident without me pointing it out, but once having done so, I think it's not too hard to identify the Greek or Hellenistic elements, right, in the with respect to the form that the human anatomy takes, some of the details in the hairstyling, some of the details related to the clothing, for instance, how the robes hang off the body and so forth. Towards the center of the Indian subcontinent, we have a kind of more purely Indian artistic tradition, what we might call classical Indian art. Artists there producing stone relief sculpture with naturalistic flowing human and animal forms. Very often a very kind of busy artistic design. And this would constitute classical Indian art, very often associated with religious structures, for instance, Buddhist stupas. What we see here, one very famous stupa, famous because it's a really good representation of this kind of classical Indian art, the Sanchi stupa. By the way, the stupa is a Buddhist place of worship, in case you're not familiar with that term. Another very famous one being located in a place called Barhut. And then we should also consider literary developments. We see kind of the perfection of Sanskrit literature, a high form of literature often associated with religious themes. So we see also kind of the perfection of Sanskrit grammar by a fellow named Panini, circa 300 B.C.E. This is in fact the standard until today. And probably the two masterpieces of Sanskrit culture being produced during the Mauryan period, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, both of which took shape by around 200 CE. probably most famous is the Mahabharata, which is actually a collection of texts, so it's quite large, and mostly concerned with the nature of dharma, right? Moral and cosmic law. We've already learned a bit about dharma. And probably the most famous text contained within the Mahabharata is the Bhagavad Gita, which translates as Song of the Blessed Lord. This one you'll find pretty much in any bookstore without too much trouble. And that does correspond to the fact that it's probably the most influential of all Indian religious texts outside of Hinduism, right? In terms of influencing non-Hindus, maybe even influencing other religions in some measure. Now, for most Hindus, probably, what defines their religious life more than anything, what is the mainstay of their religious life, is the devotional cult. And devotional cults vary tremendously across India, right, in terms of, how they are carried out, how worship precedes, exactly which gods are being worshipped. But now, partly because of, this greater level of contact during the time of the Mauryan Empire, certain practices are becoming much more pervasive. Devotional cults, in terms of how they're actually conducted, starting to resemble one another a bit more. Maybe certain gods are becoming more commonly focused on. Probably the most important two gods with respect to devotional cults eventually becoming Krishna and Rama, both seen as incarnations of the god Vishnu. Brahmins, the role of Brahmins becoming much more defined during the time of the Mauryan Empire. Their importance primarily connected with Vedic learning and ritual. So they are kind of the keepers of this knowledge. But again, the devotional cults, as far as, how does a Hindu express their faith? It is primarily in this manner. Having said that, right, we are seeing, certain elements of Hinduism that are now becoming pervasive throughout the Indian subcontinent and, kind of defining a shared understanding of Hinduism, right? So, for instance, consolidation of the caste system with Brahmins at the top. Not just that everyone accepts the same caste system, but many of the details of how each caste actually functions, its roles socially and so forth, becoming kind of set and really becoming shared throughout the Indian subcontinent. We see the development of a high culture based on Sanskrit learning that is pervasive throughout the Indian subcontinent. The increasing importance of devotional cults, right? Even if the actual content of each devotional cult might vary somewhat, the importance of the cult in and of itself becoming a shared element. And the idea that in terms of who you worship, increasingly we're seeing Vishnu and also the god Shiva becoming important in that regard. And this also, if we look at it more broadly speaking, a combining of new practices with older aesthetic and speculative traditions dating from the Upanishadic age, kind of defining in a broader sense the process that is taking place during the Mauryan Empire. And so we should come back to Buddhism, which during this period thriving as well, particularly in connection with monasticism. This kind of, because of the patronage that Buddhism is receiving from the king, but also from merchants, a tremendous amount of wealth, providing financial support to monks, the building of monasteries, and so forth. And we should note also that during this period, we're seeing the development of a cult of personality around the figure of Buddha, where he's starting to seem more like a religious figure, related to which there's going to be a growing emphasis on pilgrimage, right? The idea of visiting sites associated with the early life of Buddha, the idea that they have some kind of holy quality associated with them. And a lot of this is laying the foundation for the spread of Buddhism further afield, eventually spreading to Central Asia, China, and Japan, remembering that many merchants are adopting Buddhism, so they're bringing it with them when they head out on the trade routes and so forth. Eventually, Buddhism will die out in India, in fact, but it will continue to flourish in many parts of Asia, particularly in Southeast Asia and Tibet. But that doesn't happen right away. For the time being, prospering in India under royal and mercantile patronage, i.e. merchants, and especially flourishing in urban centers, right? And alongside of this, as I already mentioned, Buddhist popular practice beginning to center on the Buddha as almost a religious figure, and then eventually even adopting other, in some cases adopting Indian deities and transforming them into Buddhist saints, right? So increasingly starting to resemble something more akin to a religion. This really marks a departure from the original tradition of the Buddhist theological texts, which were more about, almost like an instruction manual for how to achieve nirvana, where the Buddha was just a guide. He happened to discover the secret to doing this, became enlightened, hence the term Buddha, the enlightened one, but not someone who you should pray to, right? Rather more someone who might provide a model so that you might achieve nirvana as well. But that's beginning to change. And that will actually become a big part of our discussion of developments in China down the road, where we're going to see the development of a number of different Buddhist sects. But that's for later. And we're almost done with this chapter. Just by way of wrapping up, we're going to look at some broader developments in the surrounding territories, particularly Central Asia, where much as we've seen in the past, again, population pressures causing large-scale migration out of Central Asia, in this case into northern India and Iran, right? So we're going to see incursions of tribal peoples from Central Asia between 250 B.C.E. and 300 C.E. Mostly these are pastoral, what we sometimes call steppe peoples. And again, this always seems to be happening periodically. And what this really reflects is the topography there, right? So these are what we call steppes, these vast open plains, which have, in a sense, limited resources, can only sustain a certain number of people, and when the population surpasses that, it basically forces people to migrate outward. And eventually, some of them are going to establish new peoples in different areas where they settle down. So, for instance, the Parthians are going to settle down on the Iranian plateau, in some ways displacing the Persian political elite, but very quickly absorbing Persian culture, even though somewhat influenced by Hellenistic culture. And so then establishing the next Persian Empire, beginning with a fellow named Mithridates I. So eventually still a Persian Empire, but with a new ruling elite, but one that very quickly adopts Persian culture, Persian political traditions. Some other steppe people that are going to have an impact, the Sakas are a steppe people who overrun the northeastern part of Iran, also a region known as Bactria, and then eventually extend their domain into northern and western India. They are later driven out by another steppe people, the Kushans, who sweep into northwestern India, and eventually establish a stable-ish empire from the upper Oxus regions deep into India. And here you can see, for instance, that the Kushans, very often what happens with these steppe people, for the most part, they adopt the culture of the, shall we say, more highly developed civilization that they end up conquering. In this case, reflective of Greco and Buddhist traditions. And in fact, the Kushans will very actively promote Buddhism. And here you see a map indicating the Kushan Empire, which is quite vast. So, not really introducing a lot that's new, but perhaps playing an important role in the spread of already existing traditions, sometimes by virtue of, connecting territories that previously had been separate by virtue of conquering them, right, and creating this new empire. So, let us conclude by just getting an overview of the world circa 150 CE. And so we can see that you have the Parthian Empire in what today is Iran. You have the Kushan Empire, kind of corresponding to the northwestern part of India, modern day Pakistan. We have the Han Chinese Empire, which we've yet to look at. And then around the Mediterranean, the Roman Empire, which before we look at, and they're coming up very soon, but we're going to turn to developments in Africa. And so we'll stop there. But just to note one last thing, you'll note a dotted line there. That is supposed to represent the Silk Road, but I do want to make clear the Silk Road is not actually a single road, but actually a network of roads and sea routes connecting China to the Mediterranean and all points in between. So we conclude there, and as usual, do not forget to answer the lecture-based questions.